Understood, Marcus replied, his tone guarded. Wanting to meet you there? Elijah felt a surge of appreciation for his deputy's loyalty. No need, Marcus. I'll be in soon. As he ended the call, Elijah felt his resolve harden. He'd addressed these situations before, but never in such an overt, face-to-face confrontation. He knew that the only way forward was to face Rogers and Morris head-on. Calmly, professionally, but without giving an inch. The station was quiet when Elijah walked in. The soft hum of computers and the distant chatter of night shift officers created a familiar backdrop, and he took a moment to ground himself in the environment he knew so well. For all the challenges he'd faced, this was his domain, and he had earned the respect of his team through years of commitment and integrity. As Elijah approached his office, he noticed a few officers glance up, surprise flashing across their faces. It was clear word of his unexpected arrival had yet to spread, but there was something else, a hint of uncertainty in their expressions, as if they'd sensed the tension surrounding his return. Deputy Marcus Harlan appeared from his office, his expression carefully neutral. "Chief," he said, nodding with a respectful smile, though his eyes held a silent question. "Good to have you back." "Good to be back, Marcus," Elijah replied, his voice steady. He motioned for Marcus to follow him into his office, closing the door behind them. "Let's sit down for a moment." Marcus took a seat across from him, his posture attentive. "I take it this has to do with Rogers and Morris?" he asked, the directness in his voice underscoring the trust between them. Elijah nodded, leaning back. "You know anything about those two I should be aware of?" Marcus sighed, his gaze shifting as he considered the question. "They're old school, good at their jobs, but they've made it clear they don't particularly agree with the direction you've taken the department. They're resistant." "Resistant," Elijah echoed thoughtfully. He appreciated Marcus's diplomacy, but he could read between the lines. "I've kept my eye on them," Marcus added carefully. "They've never stepped too far out of line, at least not in a way that could be documented. But the attitude's there, no doubt." Elijah's gaze hardened. "Well, tonight they made that attitude clear. They were waiting for me, Marcus, and let's just say they weren't subtle about their lack of respect." Marcus looked down, shaking his head. "That's unacceptable." "Agreed," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "But we'll address it calmly and professionally. I'll be watching them, and if they cross the line again, they'll have to answer for it." The two men shared a look of understanding, an unspoken agreement that the department would not tolerate this kind of division. They'd built too much trust within the community, too much goodwill, to let two officers undermine it. As the conversation wound down, Marcus gave a firm nod. "You know I've got your back, Elijah. Let me know if you need anything." "Thanks, Marcus. I appreciate it." In the following days, Elijah carried out his duties as usual, though a quiet vigilance settled over him. He kept a close eye on Rogers and Morris, noting their interactions with other officers and the subtle glances they shot his way during meetings. They were careful, never outright disrespectful when others were around, but the undertone of defiance was unmistakable. Elijah made a point to remain professional, refusing to engage with their provocations. He knew that, as chief, he had to set the standard for the department, to show that he would not be rattled by their behavior. But inside, he felt the tension mounting, a simmering frustration that he kept tightly contained. One evening, as he prepared to leave the station, he crossed paths with Rogers in the hallway. The officer gave him a curt nod, his expression blank, but his eyes carrying an unmistakable challenge. Elijah returned the nod, his gaze steady, unyielding. "Elijah." The voice was quiet, but filled with an unspoken tension. Rogers held his gaze, the silence stretching between them. Finally, the officer spoke, his tone laced with a thin veneer of respect. "Chief." Elijah took a slow breath, his posture relaxed but his focus sharp. "Officer Rogers, something on your mind?" For a moment, Rogers hesitated, his jaw working as if he were holding something back. "Just wondering if certain changes you've been making are really what's best for this department," he said, his voice measured. Elijah felt a familiar surge of irritation, but kept his voice calm. "I make decisions based on what's best for our community and this department, Rogers. I would hope my officers understand and support that." Rogers gave a faint, almost mocking smile. "Of course, Chief. Just wondering." With that, he nodded and walked away, leaving Elijah standing in the hallway, a lingering unease settling over him. He knew that Rogers wasn't finished, that this was just the beginning of a subtle, persistent challenge to his authority. A few days later, an incident occurred that confirmed Elijah's suspicions. During a routine briefing, as Elijah outlined an initiative aimed at increasing community engagement, he noticed Rogers and Morris exchanging glances, their expressions carefully neutral, but their body language unmistakably dismissive. Elijah chose to ignore it, focusing instead on his presentation. But as he wrapped up, Rogers cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Chief," Rogers began, his tone bordering on insolence, "I'm just not sure if this community outreach is really what our department should be prioritizing. Seems to me we've got more pressing issues to address." Elijah met his gaze, calm but unyielding. "And what issues do you think are more pressing, Officer Rogers?" Rogers hesitated, as if realizing he'd overstepped, but he pressed on, his tone defiant. "I think we ought to focus on law enforcement, not on playing nice with people who don't respect what we do." Elijah's voice was quiet, but filled with a steady authority. "Respect isn't something we demand, officer. It's something we earn. And part of our job is ensuring that the community knows we're here for them, not just to enforce the law, but to serve." The room fell silent, the tension thick as every officer watched the exchange. Elijah held Rogers' gaze, refusing to let the officer's challenge shake him. After a moment, Rogers looked away, muttering something under his breath, but the damage had been done. Elijah took a slow breath, letting the silence settle before he addressed the rest of the room. "I expect each of you to approach this role with respect and professionalism," he said, his gaze sweeping over his team. "Anything less won't be tolerated." As the officers dispersed, Elijah saw Marcus watching him from across the room, a look of quiet solidarity in his eyes. Elijah nodded in acknowledgement, a silent message of thanks. He knew that he had the support of most of his team, but Rogers and Morris's defiance cast a shadow over the department, a growing threat to the unity he had worked so hard to build. Over the next week, the air in the Brookdale Police Department was thick with unspoken tension. Elijah was aware of it, as were his officers, though most chose to keep their heads down and focus on their work. A few, including Deputy Marcus Harlan, were more vocal in their support, ensuring that Elijah knew he wasn't alone. Still, Elijah's interactions with officers Rogers and Morris remained fraught with veiled disrespect, their actions a series of small but deliberate tests of his patience. The officers' behavior had shifted into something even subtler and more insidious than outright rebellion. They were careful, choosing moments when others weren't looking, saying just enough to needle him without crossing any lines they could be disciplined for. And while their words might have seemed harmless to anyone else, Elijah knew better. He could see the challenge in their eyes, the defiance in their posture, the faint smirks they shot his way during briefings. Elijah had dealt with these kinds of challenges before, of course, but he'd hoped Brookdale was different, that his years of service and the respect he'd earned from most of his officers would insulate him from such tensions. But it was clear that, at least for these two, his authority was something to be undermined, if not outright dismissed. One late afternoon, Elijah was invited to speak at a community event held at Brookdale's town hall. It was a casual gathering organized by a local community group that aimed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. Elijah welcomed the opportunity. It was precisely the kind of initiative he believed in, the kind of event that allowed officers to connect with the residents they served. As Elijah took his place at the front of the room, he noticed Rogers and Morris standing near the back. They weren't required to attend, but their presence felt more like an act of silent protest than support. Elijah chose to ignore them, focusing on the crowd before him. Townspeople of all ages, from curious teens to elderly couples, filled the seats, their expressions a mix of interest and hope. He began speaking about the values of trust, accountability, and service, highlighting the importance of officers being approachable and empathetic. He reminded the audience that Brookdale's law enforcement was committed to upholding justice with fairness and respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The crowd nodded along, their expressions encouraging. A thoughtful expression on his face. Marcus had been his steadfast supporter, a friend who had stood by him through every trial. But there was a new weight in his gaze, something that told Elijah this visit was more than just a routine check-in. "Chief," Marcus began, closing the door behind him, "I wanted to talk to you about Rogers." Elijah felt a flicker of apprehension, but gestured for Marcus to continue. "Since the review, I've noticed a change in him. He's been quieter, less confrontational. It's like maybe he's finally realizing that things are different now. I think maybe he's starting to understand what you're trying to do here." Elijah listened, his expression thoughtful. He had hoped that Rogers would come around, but he knew change didn't happen overnight. "I hope you're right, Marcus," he said finally. "I've tried to show him that this department is about something bigger than any one of us. Maybe with time he'll come to believe that." Marcus nodded, a hint of a smile softening his features. "I think he's starting to see it, Chief, and I think he respects you, even if he doesn't want to admit it." Elijah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a start, a small step toward healing the rift that had divided his team. He knew there was still work to be done, but this moment of understanding was a reminder that progress, however slow, was possible. As the weeks passed, Elijah focused on fostering a culture of respect and accountability within the department. He held regular meetings, inviting open discussions, and encouraging his officers to share their experiences. He made it clear that every voice mattered, that each officer had a role in shaping the future of their team. The changes were gradual, but unmistakable. There was a renewed sense of purpose, a collective commitment to the values Elijah had championed from the beginning. Officers who had once been hesitant now showed enthusiasm, pride in their work, and a dedication to serving Brookdale with integrity. Rogers and Morris remained part of the department, their conduct monitored closely, but even they seemed to be adjusting to the new standard. They no longer openly defied Elijah, and while there was still tension, it was tempered by a growing acknowledgement of the direction he was leading them. For Elijah, this journey had been filled with trials, moments of doubt, and challenges that had tested his strength. But as he looked around at his team, at the officers who had chosen to stand by him, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had faced the darkness, the uncertainty, and emerged stronger, more resilient. This wasn't the end of his journey, but a new beginning, a chance to continue building a legacy of justice and integrity, to lead Brookdale with honor and unwavering commitment. And as he moved forward, he knew he would carry this experience with him, a reminder of the strength that came from standing true to his principles. As the weeks wore on, the disciplinary measures against Rogers and Morris settled in. Their suspension period ended, and they returned to the department, their presence less confrontational, but still tinged with the lingering effects of past tensions. Elijah was determined to give them a chance to prove they could uphold the department's standards. Yet he remained cautious, knowing that true change required more than policy. One morning, Elijah was at his desk when there was a knock on his door. He looked up to see Morris standing in the doorway, his face uncharacteristically serious. "Chief," Morris began, his tone formal. "Do you have a minute?" Elijah gestured for him to come in, curious about the unexpected visit. Morris took a seat across from him, his gaze fixed on the floor for a moment before he spoke. I wanted to talk to you about everything that's happened," Morris said slowly, as if choosing each word with care. "I know things got complicated, and I know I haven't made things easy for you." Elijah watched him, maintaining a calm expression. "Go on." Morris took a deep breath, finally meeting Elijah's gaze. "To be honest, I didn't think much of the changes you brought in. Thought they were just distractions. I was wrong about that. After everything with the review, it's made me think about what it means to be here, to be part of this team." Elijah nodded, his tone thoughtful. "I appreciate you sharing that, Morris. Change is never easy, especially when it challenges us to look at our work and ourselves differently." Morris's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded. "I guess I never thought of it that way. But seeing how everyone's come together, how things are different now, I realize I was standing in the way." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Elijah's mouth. "I'm glad you can see that. Being part of this department is about more than enforcing the law. It's about creating trust, showing the people of Brookdale that we're here for them." Morris hesitated, his voice quiet but sincere. I'll work on it, Chief. I want to be part of this in the right way. Elijah felt a surge of satisfaction, a sense that perhaps, finally, progress was being made. He extended a hand, which Morris accepted, and they shared a handshake that felt like the first real connection they'd had since their working relationship began. "Thank you, Morris," Elijah said warmly. "This is what it takes to move forward: accountability, growth, and commitment. I'm here to support you every step of the way." As Morris left his office, Elijah felt a renewed sense of hope. He knew there would still be challenges, but this moment felt like a breakthrough, a sign that his efforts to rebuild unity were starting to bear fruit. In the weeks that followed, Elijah noticed a palpable shift within the department. Officers who had once seemed wary or skeptical began showing a renewed dedication to their roles. There was a newfound sense of solidarity that manifested in small but meaningful ways. Officers working collaboratively, supporting one another during difficult shifts, and volunteering for community events. Even Rogers, while still maintaining a certain guardedness, was notably more restrained. He followed protocol, responded to Elijah's directives without question, and maintained a level of professionalism that, while not warm, showed a willingness to coexist peacefully. Elijah tried to acknowledge these changes, offering positive reinforcement during briefings and expressing his gratitude individually to those who showed commitment to the department's values. His approach was met with quiet appreciation, a subtle but clear indication that his efforts to build trust were paying off. Elijah decided to hold a community event at the local park, inviting residents to meet with the officers, ask questions, and share any concerns they had. It was an initiative he'd launched months ago, but this time, the atmosphere was different. There was a warmth, an openness that hadn't been present before. As Elijah and his team set up tables with brochures, informational pamphlets, and refreshments, he was struck by the genuine enthusiasm of his officers. Laura Perez, always dedicated and passionate, worked the booth with a friendly smile, chatting with residents and answering questions with ease. To Elijah's surprise, Rogers joined the event with a noticeable effort to engage. Though reserved, he greeted residents politely, helping distribute informational handouts and answering questions from curious locals. Elijah watched the interactions unfold, feeling a quiet pride as he observed his team rallying together. A young boy approached the booth, staring up at the officers with wide eyes. Rogers knelt down, offering him a small pin with the department's emblem, and the boy's face lit up with delight. Elijah couldn't help but smile, a sense of accomplishment filling him as he saw the impact of his team's efforts to build trust. Later in the evening, Linda Garrett, the business owner who had once expressed concern about the department's direction, approached Elijah with a warm smile. "Chief Brooks," she began, her voice filled with appreciation, "I just wanted to say thank you. I can see the difference you're making. It's brought something good back to Brookdale." Elijah felt a surge of gratitude, his expression softening. "Thank you, Linda. That means a lot. We're here for Brookdale, and I'm grateful for the community's support." Linda nodded, glancing around at the officers engaging with residents. "You've brought integrity to this department, Chief. People see that, and they trust you for it." Elijah watched her walk away, a sense of peace settling over him. This was the moment he had been working toward, the knowledge that, despite the obstacles, he had earned the community's trust, one step at a time. That night, Elijah returned to his office, sitting in the quiet as he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought of the challenges he'd faced, the opposition, the moments of doubt, the difficult conversations that had tested his patience and resolve. He'd fought hard to bring change, to inspire a department that believed in justice, integrity, and service. For the first time, he felt a true sense of fulfillment, a knowledge that his efforts had not been in vain. He had stood firm, had faced each challenge with resilience, and had emerged stronger, his team united in purpose and commitment. The phone on his desk buzzed, and he picked it up, surprised to hear Marcus's voice on the other end. "Elijah," Marcus said, a note of pride in his tone. "Just wanted to say, you did it. You've brought us all together, made this place something we can be proud of." Elijah felt a wave of emotion, his voice quiet as he replied, "Thank you, Marcus. I couldn't have done it without you. and without everyone who believed in what we were building. Marcus chuckled softly. Well, Chief, we've got your back, and we're ready to face whatever comes next. Elijah hung up, a sense of pride and gratitude filling him. He looked around his office, the familiar walls a reminder of the countless hours he'd spent working toward this goal. This was more than a job. It was a calling, a responsibility he would honor every day he served. With a quiet smile, he gathered his things and headed out, the weight of the past months lifting from his shoulders. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt truly at peace, knowing that he had earned the respect of his team and the trust of the community he was sworn to protect. And as he walked into the night, the quiet streets of Brookdale bathed in a soft glow, Elijah felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, his resolve unbreakable, his purpose clear. In the weeks following the community event, Brookdale's police department settled into a rhythm marked by renewed trust and cooperation. Elijah observed his team with quiet pride, noting how they moved with purpose, each officer taking ownership of their role. The department felt like a cohesive unit, a team that respected one another and valued the mission they shared. One day, as Elijah prepared to lead a weekly briefing, he felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in months. He reviewed his notes, eager to present new initiatives designed to further improve community relations. His recent experiences had taught him that progress wasn't a single leap forward, but a series of small, steady steps, each one essential in creating lasting change. The room quieted as Elijah stepped to the front. He looked around, meeting the eyes of his officers, many of whom nodded in encouragement. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice steady. I want to thank each of you for the work you've put into building trust with this community. Over the past months, we've faced some difficult challenges, but we've come through them stronger. I'm proud of the progress we've made, and I know that together we'll continue to grow. He paused, letting his words settle. To keep building on that progress, I've been working on a few initiatives. First, we'll be setting up monthly community forums to provide a space where residents can voice their concerns, ask questions, and get to know us better. Laura Perez, sitting near the front, raised her hand, a spark of enthusiasm in her eyes. Chief, I'd love to help organize those. I think the forums could make a real difference. Elijah smiled, nodding. Thank you, Perez. I appreciate your commitment. He glanced around the room, seeing the nods of approval, the looks of quiet determination on the faces of his team. Even Rogers and Morris, who had once challenged his every decision, seemed engaged, their expressions thoughtful. This department is a family, Elijah continued, his voice filled with emotion. And like any family, we're here to support one another, to grow together, and to build something that lasts. I want each of you to know that my door is always open. If you have ideas, concerns, or even questions, don't hesitate to come to me. We're in this together. The meeting concluded with a sense of optimism, a renewed commitment that resonated with everyone in the room. Elijah left with a feeling of satisfaction, his heart filled with hope for the future. The monthly community forums quickly became a staple of Brookdale's police department, drawing residents from all walks of life. Elijah and his team worked tirelessly to make each forum welcoming and accessible, encouraging open dialogue and fostering trust with every interaction. At one of the first forums, a young woman named Mia approached Elijah, her face filled with apprehension. She explained that her family had had a difficult experience with law enforcement in another town, and she'd been hesitant to trust officers ever since. Elijah listened intently, nodding as she spoke, his expression one of empathy and understanding. Mia, I'm sorry that happened to you and your family, he said gently. Here in Brookdale, we're committed to building a department that treats everyone with respect. If there's ever anything I can do to make you feel safer, please don't hesitate to reach out. Mia's face softened, and she offered a tentative smile. Thank you, Chief Brooks. It means a lot to hear that. As the forums continued, more residents began to open up, sharing their thoughts, concerns, and even praise for the department's recent improvements. The forums became a place where Elijah's officers, including Rogers and Morris, could interact directly with the community, learning firsthand the importance of building relationships based on mutual respect and transparency. One evening, as the forum wrapped up, Rogers approached Elijah with a contemplative expression. "Chief," he began, his tone tentative, "these forums, they're actually making a difference, aren't they? People seem to be connecting with us." Elijah nodded, his gaze steady. "They are, Rogers. This is what it means to serve, to understand the people we're here to protect." Rogers nodded slowly, as if processing the idea. "Guess I didn't see it that way before." Elijah offered him a small smile. "Growth comes from openness, Rogers. I appreciate you taking the time to be here, to listen." The moment felt like a small victory, a sign that Rogers was beginning to see the bigger picture. For Elijah, it was a reminder that even the most resistant individuals could change, given the right opportunities. The newfound unity within the department extended beyond just community outreach. Officers supported one another on and off the job, forming bonds that went beyond their shared responsibilities. They organized weekly gatherings, volunteer days, and even a community cleanup event that brought officers and residents together for a day of service. Elijah encouraged these activities, recognizing the positive impact they had on his team's morale. He knew that building trust within the department was just as important as fostering it with the community, and he was grateful to see his officers embracing these initiatives with enthusiasm. During one of the volunteer days, Elijah found himself working alongside Marcus, Rogers, and Morris as they helped repaint a playground at a local park. The task was simple, but the camaraderie it fostered was invaluable. They laughed, shared stories, and for the first time in months, Elijah felt a sense of ease around Rogers and Morris. At one point, Rogers paused, looking over at Elijah with a faint smile. "You know, Chief, I used to think this kind of stuff was, well, a waste of time, but it actually feels good to be out here, doing something for the community." Elijah nodded, his expression warm. "It's about giving back, Rogers. We're here to protect, but we're also here to build a community that trusts us." Rogers nodded thoughtfully, a look of understanding in his eyes. "Guess I never saw it that way before." For Elijah, these moments of connection were the culmination of his efforts, a sign that his team was finally united, not just in duty, but in purpose. As the positive changes within the department continued to unfold, Mayor Ellis reached out to Elijah, inviting him to City Hall for a meeting. Elijah arrived with a sense of anticipation, eager to discuss the progress they had made and the direction he hoped to continue pursuing. "Chief Brooks," the mayor greeted him warmly, shaking his hand. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to talk to you about the recent changes in the department. I have to say, I'm impressed." Elijah took a seat, his posture confident but humble. "Thank you, Mayor. The credit belongs to my team. They've shown real dedication to our mission." The mayor nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've received a lot of positive feedback from residents. They've noticed the increased outreach, the events, the forums. It's clear that people are starting to trust the department in a way they hadn't before." Elijah felt a sense of pride, his heart swelling as he listened to the mayor's words. "That's always been my goal, to build a department that serves with integrity and earns the community's respect." The mayor leaned forward, a look of respect in his eyes. "You've done an incredible job, Elijah. I know it hasn't been easy, but you've led this department with resilience and vision. Brookdale is lucky to have you." Elijah left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose, feeling validated in his efforts and hopeful for the future. He knew that the journey wasn't over, but the mayor's words served as a reminder that his leadership had made a difference, that his commitment to justice had brought positive change to Brookdale. As time went on, Elijah continued to lead with integrity and compassion, guiding his team through challenges and celebrating their successes. The department had become a source of pride for Brookdale, a symbol of resilience and unity in a town that had once harbored skepticism and doubt. Elijah's relationships with his officers deepened, particularly with Rogers and Morris, who had transformed from adversaries to colleagues he could rely on. They were still learning, still adjusting to the new standards Elijah had set, but they were committed to the department's mission, and Elijah respected them for it. One afternoon, as he walked through the station, he overheard Rogers speaking to a new recruit, explaining the importance of community trust and integrity in law enforcement. Elijah paused, listening with a sense of satisfaction as Rogers articulated the values he had once questioned. "Listen," Rogers was saying, his tone earnest. "This job isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about showing people they can trust us. It's about standing for something, even when it's not easy." The recruit nodded, clearly taking Rogers' words to heart. Elijah continued on, a quiet smile playing on his lips. This was the legacy he had hoped to build, a department that believed in justice, that understood the power of trust, and that was united in purpose. Years passed, and Brookdale's police department became known for its dedication to the community, its unwavering commitment to justice, and the unity that had carried it through difficult times. Elijah's leadership had left an indelible mark, shaping a team that stood together through challenges, that valued integrity above all else. When Elijah finally decided to retire, his team gathered to celebrate his legacy, honoring the years he had dedicated to building something greater than himself. Officers who had been with him from the beginning, along with new recruits who had joined in recent years, all spoke of the impact he had made, the lessons he had taught them. Rogers, now a senior officer, approached Elijah at the end of the celebration, his expression filled with respect. "Chief, I just want to say thank you. I didn't always make it easy, but you showed me what it means to lead, to be part of something real." Elijah placed a hand on Rogers' shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "Thank you, Rogers. You've grown into a leader this department can be proud of. I know you'll continue to uphold the values we've built together." As Elijah left the station one last time, he looked back, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. He had faced opposition, endured hardship, and led through uncertainty, but he had emerged stronger, leaving behind a legacy built on trust, resilience, and unwavering integrity. And as he walked into the next chapter of his life, he knew that Brookdale's police department would continue to thrive, carrying forward the values he had instilled, a beacon of hope and justice for years to come. 2 years had passed since Elijah's retirement, and Brookdale had continued to flourish. Under the guidance of the department's new leadership, a team trained and inspired by Elijah's own methods, the department remained a model of integrity, earning a reputation that reached beyond Brookdale's borders. Surrounding communities admired the way Brookdale's officers handled their duties, with respect, empathy, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Elijah had settled into retirement with the same quiet dignity that had defined his career. He spent his days volunteering with local nonprofits, mentoring young people, and occasionally giving guest lectures at the nearby police academy. His influence continued to ripple outward, inspiring a new generation of officers who looked to him as an example of what it meant to lead with honor. On a sunny autumn morning, Elijah received an invitation that surprised him. The department had planned a dedication ceremony to honor his years of service, unveiling a new community center named after him, the Elijah Brooks Center for Trust and Service. It was a facility designed to bring officers and residents together, a place for dialogue, workshops, and community building, a physical embodiment of the ideals Elijah had championed throughout his career. The day of the ceremony arrived, and Elijah found himself standing before a crowd of familiar faces. His former officers, city officials, community members, and even Mayor Ellis had gathered to pay tribute to his legacy. The atmosphere buzzed with warmth and gratitude, a testament to the countless lives Elijah had touched. The new chief of police, Laura Perez, stepped up to the podium, her voice filled with emotion as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we celebrate not only a man who served this community, but a leader who transformed it. Chief Elijah Brooks taught us that the heart of policing isn't about power. It's about service, trust, and standing for what's right, even when it's difficult. This center is more than a building. It's a reminder of the principles he instilled in all of us." She gestured toward Elijah, and the crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing across the square. Elijah felt a wave of emotion, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had never sought recognition. His only goal had been to serve with integrity. But standing there, surrounded by the people he'd come to know and love, he felt deeply humbled. As the applause subsided, Laura invited him to the podium. Elijah took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he addressed the gathering. "Thank you, everyone," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This is an honor I never expected, and I'm deeply moved by it. But the truth is, this legacy isn't mine alone. It belongs to every officer who believed in our mission, every resident who trusted us, and every person who chose to stand for justice. We built this together." He paused, his gaze settling on familiar faces in the crowd, many of whom had been there from the beginning. "I spent my career believing that a badge is more than a symbol of authority. It's a commitment to serve with compassion and integrity. Brookdale taught me that, and it's something I hope this center will continue to teach for generations to come. My only hope is that, as we move forward, we remember that justice is a collective effort. It requires each of us to stay true to our values, to treat one another with respect, and to believe in the power of community." The crowd listened in reverent silence, his words resonating deeply. As he finished, Elijah felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet but certain knowledge that his journey had come full circle. He stepped back, the crowd's applause filling the air once more, their appreciation a testament to the impact he had made. After the ceremony, Elijah wandered through the new community center, admiring the dedication wall where photos and plaques highlighted the history of Brookdale's police department. There was a framed photograph of him in his early days as chief, a reminder of how much had changed since he'd first taken on the role. He smiled, his heart filled with gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. As he walked through the halls, he spotted familiar faces, former officers, old friends, and community members who had supported him over the years. Rogers approached him, a respectful smile on his face. "Chief," he greeted, his voice steady, "I just wanted to say thank you. You gave us all a chance to see things differently, and you showed me what real leadership looks like." Elijah extended his hand, and they shook firmly, a bond of mutual respect passing between them. "Thank you, Rogers. It's been a privilege to serve with you." Morris joined them, his expression equally sincere. "We're carrying on what you started, Chief. The team's stronger than ever, thanks to you." Elijah nodded, pride swelling within him. He knew that the department was in good hands, that the values he had fought for would continue to guide Brookdale for years to come. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the town, Elijah took a final walk through Brookdale's streets, reflecting on the legacy he had built. He passed the coffee shop where he'd held so many conversations with residents, the town square where he'd met with community leaders, and the station that had been the heart of his work for so many years. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had given everything he could to the community that had become his home. He had left a mark, not through force or authority, but through respect, empathy, and a relentless dedication to justice. In the years to come, people would continue to speak of Chief Elijah Brooks, not just as a leader, but as a man who had given his all to build trust, unity, and hope in Brookdale. His story would be shared with new officers, community members, and young people aspiring to make a difference. And the Elijah Brooks Center for Trust and Service would stand as a testament to his belief in the power of integrity and compassion. With one last look at the town he had served so faithfully, Elijah smiled, his heart filled with contentment. His work was complete, his journey fulfilled, and he knew, with quiet certainty, that his legacy would live on. As Elijah's journey shows, real change comes from dedication, integrity, and a commitment to doing what's right, even when it's tough. If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of resilience and leadership. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Elijah's legacy, and let us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that matter, and we're so grateful to have you with us on this journey. When Elijah Brooks becomes Brookdale's first Black police chief, he's determined to build trust and integrity in his department. But his vision quickly meets fierce resistance from two officers bent on undermining his every move. As tensions escalate, Elijah faces a crucial decision. Will he stand firm in his principles or allow division to tear the team apart? This story is a powerful journey of resilience and transformation. One man's fight to bring unity, respect, and real change. Subscribe for more stories like this, And let us know in the comments. Would you have the courage to lead like Elijah? Now, let's dive into the story. The town of Brookdale was quiet that late afternoon, as Chief Elijah Brooks felt the cool wind against his face. After a 2-week vacation, this stillness offered a comforting welcome home. Brookdale wasn't a big place by any stretch. It wasn't the kind of town that made national headlines, and that suited Elijah just fine. He'd been the police chief here for 5 years, but he'd lived in the area all his life. When he'd first taken the position as Brookdale's first black chief of police, it had been a historic moment for some, and a bitter pill for others. For years, he'd fought hard to bring unity, fairness, and genuine connection to the force and the community alike. There had been challenges, of course, some subtle and some not so much. But overall, Elijah felt he'd built something solid here, a force with integrity. Stepping out of his friend's helicopter at the empty, near-abandoned county airstrip, he felt a surge of pride in the job he was coming back to. The pilot, Roger, waved him off with a grin, saying, "You're home now, Eli. Don't let them work you too hard." Elijah chuckled, waving as Roger took off, leaving him in the expansive quiet. He slung his duffel bag over his shoulder, inhaling the scent of pine and cooling earth. The air here, a mix of forest and open fields, was refreshing, nothing like the everyday tension that came with his job back in town. For a moment, he thought about just standing there, letting himself absorb the peace of the countryside. But something disrupted that peace, the distant hum of another helicopter. Elijah looked up, narrowing his eyes as he watched the unfamiliar aircraft approach. It wasn't typical for the airstrip to get much traffic, especially at this time of day, and he hadn't heard anything from dispatch about anyone else arriving. Elijah's curiosity quickly shifted to wariness as the helicopter landed about 30 yards away. 2 men in uniforms stepped out, their stances rigid. Their uniforms marked them as police, but they were dressed more casually than on-duty officers. Elijah frowned. He'd never seen these two in Brookdale. Elijah stood his ground, expecting them to approach, to explain themselves, or at least acknowledge him with a nod. Instead, the 2 men looked around, seeming to ignore him. One whispered something to the other, his tone clipped. Elijah cleared his throat and began walking toward them. "Evening, officers," he greeted, extending a hand as he drew near. "I'm Chief Elijah Brooks. May I ask who you are?" The taller of the two, a broad-shouldered man with sharp features and a slightly curled lip, barely glanced at him. "And what exactly are you doing here, Chief?" His voice carried a hint of suspicion that bordered on disdain. Elijah blinked, surprised at the hostility in the officer's tone. He kept his voice even, unflinching. "I'm just returning from a personal trip," he replied, nodding back toward his helicopter. "Wasn't expecting any company out here." The officer, whose name tag read Rogers, looked him up and down with a smirk. "So, you're the police chief. Can't say I've seen you around." He exchanged a glance with his partner, who stood with crossed arms, a sneer curling his mouth. Elijah kept his composure, though an uneasy tension had begun to stir in him. "As I said, I'm Chief Brooks," he repeated, his tone edged with firmness. "If there's a problem, I'd appreciate it if you'd tell me." Rogers chuckled, folding his arms as he gave Elijah a once-over. "Chief of police, huh? Well, Chief, I'm not really concerned with whatever story you're spinning." A rush of anger coursed through Elijah, but he pushed it down. He'd dealt with subtle forms of disrespect before, but this felt different, more deliberate. He maintained a steady voice, saying, "If there's a misunderstanding here, I suggest you verify my identity. I'm not looking to waste anyone's time." The shorter officer, whose tag read Morris, stepped forward, his face a mask of disdain. "You're not going anywhere until we know exactly what's going on," he said, voice cold and authoritative. Elijah could see the barely concealed contempt in his eyes, the tension in his posture. Elijah took a slow breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He was the one in charge here, despite their tone. He had a responsibility to act professionally, to rise above whatever prejudice was simmering under their words. He set his jaw and took a step closer, meeting their gazes with unflinching resolve. "Gentlemen," he began, voice low but firm, "I've told you who I am. I have the authority to be here, and if you're unsure, I'm more than willing to verify my identity with dispatch. But until then, I'd appreciate if you'd treat me with the respect this position deserves." The silence hung heavy in the air as Rogers and Morris exchanged a glance. The taller man's sneer deepened, his eyes narrowing in challenge. "Respect, huh?" Rogers's voice was thick with sarcasm. "You might be in charge back in town, but out here you're just another guy with a badge." The remark hit like a slap, but Elijah kept his reaction restrained. He'd fought too hard for too long to let small-minded comments like these crack his resolve. His position, his dedication to the job, it wasn't something these men could take from him. Yet the hostility in their voices held a different edge, a simmering anger that was hard to ignore. Morris leaned in closer, his posture aggressive. "I don't think you're hearing us," he sneered. "We don't take orders from the likes of you, especially not out here." A flash of understanding hits Elijah. This wasn't just resistance to his authority. It was something uglier, deeper. He could sense it in their sneers, in the dismissive way they looked at him. The unspoken prejudice, the disdain. It was something he'd seen before, but rarely with such open hostility. This was a test, he realized, one meant to provoke him, to see if they could strip away the authority he'd worked so hard to earn. Elijah's voice was steady as he replied, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm simply returning to my duty. Now, if you'd step aside, I'll be on my way." But Rogers took a step closer, blocking his path. "Oh, I don't think you're going anywhere just yet, Chief," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Maybe we should have a little chat first. Get to know you a bit better." It was clear now. They wanted a reaction, something they could use against him. Elijah's muscles tensed, every instinct in him urging him to stand his ground. He met Rogers's gaze with an unyielding stare, determined not to let them see any sign of weakness. "Let's get one thing clear," Elijah said, his voice low, steady. "I'm not here to justify myself to anyone. Not here. Not anywhere. I've told you who I am, and I don't need your permission to do my job." Rogers's face twisted in an ugly smile, his eyes glinting with something dark, something personal. "You think you're so high and mighty, don't you?" he sneered. "You might be the big man in town, but out here you're nobody." Elijah held his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. He knew what they were doing, pushing him, try to make him react. But he'd spent his life building the self-control needed to survive moments like these, to rise above the small-mindedness that sometimes surfaced in his line of work. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I suggest you step aside. This conversation is over." But just as he moved to pass, Morris reached out, grabbing his shoulder in a rough hold. "Where do you think you're going?" he sneered, his grip tightening. "We're not done here." For a brief, tense moment, Elijah held Morris's gaze, the anger simmering beneath the surface threatening to break through. But he forced himself to stay calm, to maintain control. This wasn't a battle he could win with force or anger. It was a battle of endurance, of resilience. With a quiet, measured voice, he said, "Let go, Officer Morris." "Now!" Morris hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. But Rogers stepped forward, his expression darkening. "You're not in charge here, Chief," he spat. "Not out here." And with that, Elijah knew he was dealing with something far more insidious than a simple power struggle. He was face to face with men who saw him not as their leader, but as a target. In that moment, standing alone on the deserted airstrip with the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground, Elijah realized that this was only the beginning. The stakes had changed. And he knew, with a sinking certainty, that the road back to town, and back to his role, would be harder than he'd anticipated. But he was ready. He'd fought battles like this before, and he would face this one with the same unbreakable resolve. Elijah held his ground, forcing his breathing to remain steady. He could feel the disdain emanating from the two men before him, a silent challenge in every look and gesture. This wasn't the usual tension he faced as Brookdale's police chief. These officers, Rogers and Morris, were confronting him with something personal, something that went deeper than professional disagreement. Elijah had seen such attitudes before, but rarely with such raw animosity. The silence stretched, thick and unyielding. Rogers folded his arms, his expression one of open skepticism. "Let me ask you again, Chief," he said, his voice mocking. "What are you really doing here, sneaking in at a place like this?" Elijah noted the choice of words, the accusatory tone. They were probing, pushing him to react. He could see it in their eyes, a barely concealed challenge, a desire to strip him of his authority, to diminish him. Yet he stood firm, lifting his chin just slightly, making sure to meet their gaze without flinching. "As I said," he replied calmly, though his voice carried an unmistakable firmness, "I'm returning from a trip. I'm well within my rights to use this airstrip, as you both know." Morris shifted, blocking Elijah's path as he tried to step forward. The shorter officer was almost smirking, his eyes flickering with disdain. "Maybe you think that badge gives you some kind of special privilege," he said, voice dripping with contempt. "But out here, that badge doesn't mean a thing to us." Elijah inhaled slowly, keeping his composure. Inside, he felt the faint stirrings of frustration, the simmering anger that came when faced with such overt disrespect. But he knew better than to let it show. He'd learned, over years of facing adversity, that dignity and restraint were his greatest allies. This wasn't a fight he could afford to lose. "I don't need special privileges," Elijah replied, his tone even. "I need only the respect I've earned. If there's any question about my authority, I'm more than willing to address it back at the station." Rogers scoffed, his arms still crossed. "The station? Don't flatter yourself. You're not our chief, not out here." He tilted his head, looking Elijah up and down with a smirk that sent a surge of anger through Elijah's veins. "Maybe Brookdale can call you chief, but out here, you're just another man with an attitude problem." The words were calculated, each one dripping with derision. Elijah felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, a reflex he immediately fought to suppress. He knew this game, they wanted him to snap, to react. But he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. For a moment, he let the silence stretch, his gaze steady as he met Rogers's eyes. "I've dedicated my career to this town," he said quietly, his voice steady, unwavering. "I've put in the work, shown the dedication. If there's a misunderstanding here, let's resolve it professionally. But I won't tolerate disrespect." The silence grew even thicker, the tension almost palpable. He could see Rogers's smirk fading, replaced by something harder, colder. There was no acknowledgement in his eyes, no sign of recognition or respect. It was as if, in Rogers's mind, Elijah was nothing more than an inconvenience, a symbol of everything he resented. Morris took a step closer, his stance shifting to something more threatening. "Listen, Chief," he spat, his voice low and menacing. "You're not in charge of us. We don't answer to you, and we don't respect someone who's only here to push us around." Elijah took a breath, his patience beginning to wear thin. "I'm here to lead this department," he replied, voice tight with control. "Not to push anyone around. Now, I suggest you both reconsider your tone." For a moment, it looked as though Rogers might back down. He shifted his weight, glancing at Morris with a fleeting uncertainty. But then, as if steeling himself, he looked back at Elijah with renewed hostility, his eyes narrowing. "Reconsider our tone?" he mocked, his voice low and cold. "You've got a lot of nerve, thinking you can come out here, throwing your weight around. You don't belong here, Brooks." The words stung, but Elijah held his ground. He'd spent years facing such sentiments, learning to overcome them with resilience, to stand tall in the face of prejudice. He knew better than to let men like Rogers and Morris chip away at his self-respect. But the hostility was mounting. He could see it in their eyes, feel it in the subtle shifts of their stance. These men were looking for confrontation, and it was only his restraint that kept them from finding it. "Enough," Elijah said, his voice low, his patience nearing its limit. "You've made your point, and I've heard it. Now, if you're finished, step aside and let me return to my duty." But neither Rogers nor Morris moved. They remained planted in front of him, blocking his path, their eyes filled with defiance. Morris chuckled softly, folding his arms. "You really think you're something special, don't you?" he sneered. "Think you can just show up here, act like you're better than us? You're nothing but a fraud." Elijah felt his jaw tighten, a surge of anger flaring within him. He forced himself to breathe, to remain calm. He couldn't allow himself to be drawn into their game, couldn't let them provoke him. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice edged with a final warning, "I've given you every opportunity to show respect. This is your last chance to act professionally." Rogers took a step forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his face inches from Elijah's. "Or what?" he murmured, his tone venomous. "You think you're going to teach us a lesson? Out here, Chief, we're the ones in charge." Elijah held his gaze, refusing to back down. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a reminder of every challenge he'd ever faced, every battle he'd fought to reach this position. But he knew, instinctively, that this wasn't the time to engage. This wasn't a fight he could win with words or threats. Without another word, he turned, making a deliberate step away from the confrontation. But before he could fully turn, he felt Rogers's hand grip his shoulder, pulling him back with a force that sent him off balance. Elijah stumbled, the unexpected aggression throwing him off his guard. He straightened, meeting Rogers's gaze with a steely resolve. "Let go," he said, his voice low and unyielding. But Rogers only tightened his grip, a twisted satisfaction flickering in his eyes. "Not until you understand something, Chief," he sneered. "Out here, you're nothing. Just another guy who doesn't know his place." Elijah clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm, to keep his control. He couldn't let them bait him, couldn't let their words strip away his dignity. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, holding his ground. "I know my place," he replied, his voice quiet, controlled. "And it's leading this department, bringing integrity to our work. If that's a problem for you, I suggest you reconsider your priorities." The words hung in the air, a challenge that neither Rogers nor Morris seemed willing to accept. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, a sign that they hadn't expected Elijah to hold his ground, to maintain his composure in the face of their hostility. But as quickly as it had appeared, the uncertainty faded, replaced by a hardened resolve. "You're done here, Brooks," Rogers said coldly. "You're not our chief, not out here, and not in Brookdale." With that, he released his grip, stepping back with a look of open disdain. Elijah steadied himself, feeling the sting of their words, the weight of their contempt. But he knew, deep down, that he couldn't let them break his resolve. He couldn't afford to lose control. Without another word, he turned, his steps deliberate, measured, as he walked away from the airstrip, leaving their taunts behind. Every step was a reminder of the battle he was facing, not just with these men, but with the mindset they represented. As he left the empty airstrip behind, his mind filled with a fierce determination. This wasn't over. He'd return to Brookdale with his head held high, his resolve unbroken. And he would show Rogers, Morris, and anyone who doubted his place that his authority wasn't something they could strip away with words or threats. No matter the obstacles, he would stand firm. As Elijah walked toward town from the remote airstrip, the sky darkened into deep twilight. The quiet of the open countryside offered him a moment to collect himself, though he felt the weight of frustration pressing against his chest. He'd faced disrespect before, but this was different, more confrontational, more openly hostile. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rogers and Morris were determined to provoke him, to find some weakness in him they could exploit. Brookdale wasn't far, but the quiet trek gave Elijah space to reflect. He'd always believed in leading by example, in earning respect through his actions, not just his title. But respect, he reminded himself, was not something everyone gave freely, especially not men like Rogers and Morris, who had made it clear they held no regard for his position or authority. As he neared the edge of town, Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, noting the caller was his deputy, Marcus Harlan. "Elijah." Marcus's voice was calm, but carried a hint of urgency. "Welcome back. I heard you just landed. Everything good?" Elijah paused, considering what to share. Marcus had been his right hand since day one, a steadying presence, and someone Elijah trusted completely. But he didn't want to start his return by stirring unnecessary conflict. "I'm fine, Marcus," Elijah said, keeping his tone light. "Just some unusual company at the airstrip. 2 officers, Rogers and Morris. They were there waiting. Not exactly the warmest welcome." Marcus was silent for a moment, and Elijah could almost hear him processing the information. Rogers and Morris? Marcus said slowly. Did they cause any trouble? Elijah considered his response, choosing his words carefully. They seemed interested in challenging my right to be there, but nothing I couldn't handle. I'm on my way back to the station now.